All right, everybody, let's go ahead and resume. A hearty band of survivors still in the room.
The true believers.
That's right. If you're here, it's because you're engaged and interested, and we appreciate that you're here. I can't help but note, while I was checking on Twitter to see what's going on in the world during the break there, and saw that one of the media had been covering the lunchtime talk, had shared some comments the director had expressed about WikiLeaks, and Julian Assange had tweeted in response a rejoinder. So it's just a reminder that it's not just those of us here in the room who are paying attention, and so bear that in mind as you share your wisdom. They're watching at the Ecuadorian embassy. So, today we've explored many of the most familiar and obviously significant instruments of national power, and rightly so: military power, diplomatic leverage, intelligence capacity. These are central features of any discussion about America's national security activities and its relationship to our allies and our partners. But there are, of course, many other instruments of power that matter, ones of great significance, and some of them tend not to be covered in events like this. There's always going to be the defense-oriented panel. There's not always going to be the one that examines the tools of economic leverage and financial leverage that nations used in statecraft, and that the United States certainly features prominently in its statecraft. And I'm very happy that we're going to be doing that in this final session. It's a domain in which America does not, and no one can go it alone and have any significant effect. You have to work by, with, and through others in many ways, and that's going to come out in this discussion. So I'm going to ask our terrific panelists to help pull back the curtain on how we're organized for this, who we work with, what are the institutions and the organizations through which these sorts of modes of influence are effectuated. And as we do so, you're going to see that we've got a pretty stellar group to escort us through that area. I'm going to give a brief rundown in no particular order, just in the order I've got them in my notes. Janice Gardner, Janice is there in the middle. Janice was the first assistant secretary, not as in first as the title, but she was the first one to be the Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Analysis at the Treasury Department. Among many other things, all recounted in the bios, Janice also served as the Chief of Digital Innovation at the CIA's Global Issues Mission Center. She also was Chief of Staff for many years at the National Counterterrorism Center. Juan Zarate, immediately to my right, was the, again, first Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes at Treasury, and later served as our nation's Deputy National Security Advisor for Combating Terrorism. He's the author of the acclaimed book, Treasury's War, The Unleashing of a New Era of Financial Warfare. He currently is chairing the Center on Sanctions and Illicit Finance for the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And as someone joked with me last night, Juan, it is said that you single-handedly brought back the hug to Washington, D.C. So you deserve great credit for it. It may not have been there before. You brought it, though. Next to Janice on the right, Dr. Samantha Ravich is the principal investigator for the Cyber-Enabled Economic Warfare Project. By the way, that best title for a research project of all time. Cyber-Enabled Economic Warfare, CEEW, a new acronym for you. She's also the managing partner of a data-centric social and analytics firm called A2P. She served as the Vice President's Deputy National Security Advisor and co-chaired the National Commission for Review of Research and Development Programs in the intelligence community. She, too, is the author of a much-read book, this one on economics and democracy in East Asia. I think it pairs nicely with Juan's book as a gift, so the holidays are coming up. 2 for 1. Last but certainly not least, on the far right there, Richard Nephew was the Principal Deputy Coordinator for Sanctions Policy at the State Department and served as the lead sanctions expert on the team that began negotiations with Iran starting in 2013. He's now affiliated with Brookings as a non-resident senior fellow and is a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at the School of International and Public Affairs, SIPA, at Columbia. So we're going to have a moderated dialogue. You'll be happy, perhaps, to know where we're going to dispense with the opening statements. We're going to jump right in with a group discussion. I'm going to encourage you all to engage one another as robustly as you are willing to do so. And the more we hear from y'all and the less we hear from me, the better. That said, I'm going to move to the chair now. I thought it'd be advisable if we began with a discussion meant to get the room on some common ground regarding first, the way the United States government is organized, but in talking about that, I think it's bound to become more of an international organizations discussion as well. What are the institutions and the organizations through which these sorts of policy tools are implemented and directed. Richard, may I ask you to start by introducing us to how the State Department engages in this area?
Sure, happy to do that. So basically, the State Department has got three missions when it comes to sanctions implementation, sanctions development. The first is the most obvious. It's selling sanctions, right? It's taking the sanctions concepts that are developed in Congress, developed within the U.S. government, and then taking them around the world and trying to explain why, in fact, they're a good thing to do. And we do this in a variety of different settings and contexts. At the UN Security Council, the most obvious place where we have tried to implement sanctions, because there you've got the ability to have international binding on everyone, right? A decision taken by the Security Council is legal for everyone who is a member of the UN. But that's not the only place. We also take sanctions policies into a variety of multilateral settings that aren't UN. So we go to the European Union. We go to organizations of various different state and regional groupings to try and convince them that certain sanctions concepts and policy objectives make a lot of sense. And then, of course, we'll just go nationally. The State Department has a responsibility to go and explain to countries why we're doing something and what we expect them to do. And in this context, we can either be doing that with regard to supporting UN sanctions, or we can do it with regard to national sanctions. And in fact, a lot of what I did when I was at the State Department and responsible for this was explaining U.S. law to foreign governments and trying to explain to them why we are asking them to do something, what is the strategic context, and what we actually expect them to do. Because although we may think that some of the things that we say and do are at least a little bit understandable or legible or transparent, as I think a number of people have said up here today, once it leaves our shores, there's a heck of a lot of confusion, both about what we want, what we intend to do, and what it means. The second State Department mission is developing sanctions. Which is not something that it gets a whole heck of a lot of credit for, in part because there's a general sense, I would say, that state doesn't like sanctions, right? Or that state opposes the idea or use of sanctions. And that's true to certain extents. In fact, actually, I think, as other State Department veterans who are around here might say, you can find a position in the State Department on literally everything. And that position will be the polar opposite of somebody who will sit next door. The person who's responsible for doing East Asia Pacific affairs will absolutely hate the idea of imposing sanctions on China for missile proliferation. But if you go next door to the guys who run missile proliferation at the State Department, they're all about it. And you can find a variety of positions that would be taken up in between. So there's a cadre of folks at the State Department whose job it is to come up with new sanctions concepts. And part of the way in which state does that is through the use of our embassies and the information that we collect from abroad. It's not just the traditional intelligence community that informs what we do with sanctions policies. It's the diplomats that we have on the ground in countries around the world who can give us real sense about if you were to do this, or you were to do that, or you were to do that, it would have this kind of effect. And the kind of information gathering that's almost passive that you get out of having a diplomatic presence often informs a lot of sanctions policies that states put forward, but not just state, because the reporting cables that come out of the State Department are shared widely within the U.S. government. And then the third mission of the State Department in this area is sanctions implementation. The State Department actually has got a variety of sanctions authorities that are delegated to it directly from Congress and from the President with regard to things like economic embargoes to export controls. And so there's a large number of people at state whose day-to-day work is to actually implement and enforce sanctions. And as I said earlier about people having different positions, you can imagine how popular those guys are when it comes time to imposing sanctions on India or China or even in many cases, actually, Germany or France, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a wide range of missions that the State Department has got as part of the broader interagency effort.
So there's a view from Foggy Bottom. Let me bring both Janice and Juan in kind of simultaneously, if I can, since you both were sort of present at the creation of what maybe could be described today as a revised approach at Treasury as to how to organize, and we've living with for more than a decade now, or about a decade. What was it, 12, 13 years? Give us an overhead view of that organization, the structure, the office you ran, and then somewhere in the midst, I would love to begin to hear about how Treasury relates to state on these matters. And then in a moment, we'll get over to Samantha and talk about the views from higher up in the executive branch.
Janice, I'm going to follow your lead.
Okay. It's great to be here today. I just want to start by saying I've spent over 30 years of my career in the intelligence community, and I highly recommend it to any students who are thinking about that as a career. I've had fantastic opportunities in different organizations, and so I spent a lot of time mentoring, young college graduates. So if you're interested, we can talk afterwards. I would start off by saying we were the only finance ministry in the world that had an intelligence shop. And that's kind of how we marketed ourselves. It was in the 2004 Intelligence Authorization Bill that we were created after 9/11 to have this intelligence unit. And we were a full member of the intelligence community, the 16 agencies plus DNI, and I was considered, one of the agency heads. And so we had a seat at the table. We were able to direct a collection of intelligence that would be useful. So this was starting an office from scratch and out of the budget cycle. And so I would highly recommend anyone thinking about starting an office from scratch, don't do it out of the budget cycle. We started from practically nothing, fighting for office space, kicking other people out of the Treasury building, which is a beautiful building, and putting into secure space, all those kinds of things. So it was literally like flying the plane, building the plane as we were flying, because we had to deliver. So our mission was very narrow, and we had a very niche, I think, mission that was really exciting at the time, which was following the money, tracking terrorist finance, but really supporting the policy office. We were joined at the hip. And unlike, maybe this isn't a fair analogy, but unlike the intelligence office at state, which tends to do broad policy papers, everything we did was actionable for the policy office. Every morning, Juan and I kid that we're not only the first, we may not be the best assistant secretaries, but we'll always be the first, no matter what. So we went through and developed processes of what tools do we have in our Treasury toolkit that we can support. So we would literally take the intelligence every morning, filter it, and put it in like targeting packages so that we can say, OFAC, which is another sister office that actually handles the sanctions at Treasury, is this something that we should try to sanction? Is this something we could take to FinCEN, Financial Intelligence
Sen.
FinCEN.
Enforcement Network.
Enforcement Network. I'm not good at acronyms either. That's not a very good one.
FinCEN.
FinCEN. Or is this something that we could just get declassified talking points for one of Juan's trips as he makes? So is this a diplomatic action? Is it a sanction? So we would try to take that at a Treasury level and then take it to the executive office in terms of what other tools are in the toolkit. We talk a lot about creating this thing called FinInt, which we made up. It's financial intelligence, like HUMINT, SIGINT. My favorite is RUMINT, which is intelligence officers love RUMINT. But financial intelligence wasn't just kind of following the money, looking at wire transfers, but it was actually building all sorts of analysis for these targeting packages of what kind of tool would best be suited for that kind of target. So Juan and our undersecretary at the time were very aggressive. What can we do about this? How is it actionable? And we would get into a lot of fights, frankly, with not just State Department, but CIA and others of, we want to be able to use this intelligence. It's great that you can tell a policymaker that something bad is happening, but if you can't use it, what good is it? And the whole discussion we had about operational equities, which we couldn't get into. But so it was a great, exciting time. The Treasury office has grown quite a bit. Leslie Ireland was here a little earlier talking about cybersecurity and other roles that she's played. But basically, our role was to support Juan, so I'll turn it over to you.
Well, I felt like I was working for you, Janice.
Right.
Thank you to everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for staying till the end. This, I think, actually is the most interesting panel, not just because but it's because it's the most innovative. And part of this has to do with a lot of the new structures and doctrines and use of power post 9/11 that really were kind of in formation before 9/11, but were crystallized in some pretty dramatic ways. And I think we've already started to hear a bit of it. But let me just back the lens out. Before I do that, I want to thank Bobby. I want to commend the University of Texas and the three centers. I think I'm the only panelist who can say I've worked with both Steve Slick and Willem Bowden, who run great centers, and I went to law school with Bobby. So I'm honored to have those personal ties. But in any event, you've created a real center of gravity here for national security. So kudos to everybody. Let me back the lens out. Post 9/11, the point of the use of this power, the use of economic and financial influence, was to try to not only target rogue actors, terrorist groups, rogue states, but ultimately to unplug them from the global financial and commercial system. So the strategy was, how can you affect the budget and bottom line of these organizations that want global reach and want to either develop WMD programs or want to have terrorist networks globally, want to influence around the world. And the core sort of revelation is that any of these groups, including the Hermit Kingdom of North Korea that wants reach, has to have access to banks, has to have access to financing, has to have access to shipping, insurance. And if you can block their access to those elements of the global financial commercial order, you begin to constrict their ability to have strategic impact and reach. That was the purpose. And so everything that was built after that, strategy and then the offices, which we'll talk about, and the alliances and partnerships, which I want to get into, which I think, again, are the most interesting of the day's discussion, were in furtherance of that strategy. And in some ways, looks, to Richard's point about sort of selling these sanctions, looks and feels like a very heavy U.S.-centric model, because it is in some ways. The U.S. drives the establishment of standards. It's enforcing sanctions. It fines banks billions of dollars around the world. It brings cases against FIFA, and people wonder why, because we don't even care about soccer, right? So, but this is an international and global effort that has really interesting alliance and partnership factors at play. And so, let me do a couple things. One, explain a bit more what Janice started about the Treasury Department and the structure, and then talk about these alliances, which I think will be helpful for the discussion. What happened post 9/11 was a realization that we needed a center of gravity, a war room, for the ability to strategize and use the tools of financial and economic statecraft. These are not just traditional sanctions, but financial regulation, even, I would say, financial suasion. To Janice's point, the ability to use financial intelligence to be able to whisper in the ears of bank CEOs or finance ministers or intelligence chiefs to say, look, this is what we know about the financial networks and relationships of the enemies we have in common. And so we needed a center of gravity. With the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, the Treasury was denuded of a lot of its law enforcement. Keep in mind, before 9/11, Treasury had 40% of federal law enforcement. It had Customs, Secret Service, ATF, Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. All that went away. Fundamental question then was, what's Treasury's role in national security? The role was, how do we apply these inherent American powers economically in our national security? And so what we did was we created what is now called the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. It has this intelligence component, which Janice stood up, the only one in the world in a finance ministry, as she said. It also has the Office of Foreign Assets Control, which administers all of the U.S. sanctions programs in concert with the State Department. It has the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, which is the U.S. FIU, Financial Intelligence Unit. It administers the Bank Secrecy Act. These are all the regulations with banks and regulated entities where they have to file suspicious activity reports, currency transaction reports. You've seen these things you have to file if you're carrying over $10,000 in cash. That's something Steve does a lot. But in any event, so there's that dimension. And then there's a policy office that does a lot of the financial diplomacy and policy work, both within the government, with financial regulators, law enforcement, intelligence services, and then externally. And let me just really briefly talk to you about the three sort of areas of alliances that I think are fascinating in this space, and we can get into it a bit more, Bobby, if you want. First, you have a realm of financial diplomacy in this space that has a whole range of technocratic actors. And so in this world, you have networks of central banks and central bank governors. You have finance ministers, ministries. You have an organization called the Financial Action Task Force, which is basically the world's technocratic body for anti-money laundering, standard setting, and evaluations. You have financial intelligence units, over 120 of them around the world, that are gathering financial data within their countries and then sharing it. So there's this whole other universe of relationships. And what's interesting, a little bit like the military, a lot of them have been trained in the same places. So, I remember going around the world after 9/11, and it seemed like half of the finance ministers had been trained and taught by John Taylor, who at the time was the Undersecretary of State, professor at Stanford. It was this whole sort of cadre and a community of economists and experts who all knew each other, who were all technocratic, who all saw themselves as apolitical in many ways and part of a different class of actors. And so that's one aspect of partnerships and alliances that's really important, because post 9/11, we actually activated that set of alliances, which hadn't really been before. We did that for purposes of financial intelligence, for the use of financial tools, better use of sanctions, new regulations on reporting of things like insurance companies, et cetera. So there's one dimension of that. A second, and Richard could maybe comment on this given his work on Iran, within countries, you have divisions, certainly within governments. We have those divisions within the US. You see that even in countries like China or Russia. And so what's interesting in this space is that you've had technocrats or the central bank or finance ministers actually more in alignment with US values and interests and policies than other parts of their government. I'll give you one really quick example, if that's okay. In 2005, 2006, when we began to really pressure the North Korean regime with a new brand of sanctions, we had used a financial regulation against a private bank in Macau called Banco Delta Asia. It began to isolate the North Koreans. It infuriated the Chinese government, because the Chinese government saw this as not only interfering with the six-party talks, but also being hugely unilateral and also, frankly, threatening to the Chinese economy and to potentially financial institutions. Because, what was next? Bank of China, et cetera. What was interesting, as we unwound that pressure as part of the six-party talks, and there's a sort of a 2-year saga to this, the folks who were most angry at the change in the U.S. position were not folks at the White House like us. We're not folks in Congress. They're folks in the Chinese central bank and finance ministry who said to our Treasury officials at the time, "You're letting us down, because the pressure you were putting on us and the international community was allowing us to take the steps that we wanted to isolate this illicit activity, this North Korean behavior that, frankly, we don't want in our banking system. And so you American Treasury officials have let us down." And the Treasury official at the time that was part of this discussion said it was the most humiliating discussion he's ever had, and at the same time, the most fulfilling. Because it was that ethos of needing financial integrity in the financial system which was being echoed back from this part of the Chinese system. So that's another part of this alliance that's fascinating to watch. And it happens with Russia, it happens with China, it happens with other countries often that we're in opposition to it in other ways. The final element, the private sector. And this was really the kind of the secret sauce of the post-9/11 world. You say, look, we had sanctions on Iran for decades. We had sanctions on North Korea. We tried to use sanctions on terrorist groups or organized crime groups for years. They seem to have worked better post-9/11. Much of that has to do with the fact that the private sector became a key partner and ally in how we use these tools. We basically said to the private sector, you have to be guardians at the gate of the financial system. You have to prevent these actors from getting into your institutions, into the system, if these sanctions are to work. This isn't just about what the UN does. It's not just what Washington or Brussels says. It's what every bank, every regulated institution in the world does and says about the application of sanctions and financial regulation. And so that reformed how we thought about the strategy. When Janice would put together her intelligence packages or try to declassify them for passing to foreign governments, it was often a request to be able to pass it to foreign financial institutions. When we sent out delegations, State Department or Treasury delegations, it wasn't just to the halls of government, it was to the boardrooms of these major banks to say, do you understand the risk you're engaged in by doing business with Iran or North Korea or with this charity that has ties to Al-Qaeda? And so we began to affect the risk calculus of the private sector in a much more direct way with the information we were providing, with the regulation, with the outreach, and with what I call financial suasion to make sure that they weren't doing business with the wrong actors. And so in my mind, this was a fascinating shift because you had all sorts of new alliances that were being enabled with the U.S. pushing, but enabled to be able then to isolate these rogue actors from the financial and commercial system.
Samantha, the time you had with the Vice President's office, you're in a critical national security advisory role at a time when the Vice President was especially engaged in national security issues. You had to have a really good kind of broad perspective of many of the tools of national power that were on the table. Where did economic suasion and sanctions and all the rest of these appear to be in the mix in your office?
So when I started in the Vice President's office in March of '01, I really came with a background on two issues. One, in 2001, it was 9 years since I started writing on North Korea issues, which is crazy. It means I've been writing on these things for 25 years. All right, and 1992, when I yes, and 1992 was an interesting, time for this discussion because not only, there were actually missile tests and missile sanctions put on North Korea, and then the joint declaration in 1992. But the other piece of experience I came was I had just released my book in 2000 on free markets and democracy. That it is the free markets and the ability to earn capital and control that capital that actually gives people a reason to want a voice in their government. So when these things, kind of collided, I started in March of '01 in the Vice President's office. It seemed very intellectually engaging and how exciting this is. And of course, Vice President Cheney was, all supportive of free markets and all of these good things. And then 9/11 happens and, it really, well, clearly it shakes your world. And the things that you learn at universities and the things that you just believe in your life now are being put to the test. Okay, and on the the free markets and democracies, did we really believe in free markets? Did we really believe that this was going to be the way to help solidify partners, create new alliances, and also strengthen ourselves? Well, we did, and we worked very hard in the White House and the Vice President's office to promote those abroad. But as we were doing that, we also realized that the strength, we've always realized the strength of America is our economy, right? We are only the #1 military in the world because we are the #1 economy in the world. That is what forms the basis of our strength, of our power, of our innovation, of our creativity, right? But it also can be used in a lot of different ways to protect us. And so on the North Korea angle, as we revisited the agreed framework and realized it was not working for us. And in the summer of 2002, we realized that North Korea has a clandestine HEU program, that we have to be able to use the tools that make us strong, our economic prowess to protect ourselves. And I'll give you a particular example in a second, and why it was hard at first to bring the economic tools and power to bear in the national security space. The way it works in the White House is that the White House lays down its direction that it wants to go to, its broad direction. North Korea is a threat, Iran is a threat. We want good ideas from the interagency to tell us how to protect us against those threats. What can we do about them? They bubble up in a process around the interagency. And this is how it worked when we were in office, and then to the deputies committee, and then ultimately to the principals and the president. But as Juan and Janice and Stuart Levy and Juan, of course, was in the White House after he was at Treasury. But as the notion that we can use our economic power to protect ourselves through these sanctions was starting to bubble up in a real way. There was some interesting debates in the Situation Room from people that, frankly, hadn't grown up in the financial or economic space. They had grown up with either pure diplomatic power or hard military power. And these terms that were being thrown around, this way that we can curtail certain financial transactions, but what would it mean? How does it work? It was a real learning process to teach certain folks that had never come across these things. I remember very clearly, it was 2005-06, when Stuart came to brief on U-turn transactions. Right, and this was, and Janice and Juan can talk a little bit more about it, but this was a particular, very powerful tool that we could use because international banking transactions run through New York for a split second and then back out, essentially what it is, and you can cut them off when it, in the banking system when they land in New York before they go back out to wherever they're going in the world. It was very hard for some people to understand this. Now, hopefully, since Juan's book on Treasury Wars came out,
Which we highly recommend.
I should have brought a copy
one
here.
of the best
I'm
books.
not
you can get
promoting
it. I checked. It is $30.65 on Amazon Prime with free shipping.
Thank you.
Or you
Wow.
can. I checked it. You can get it at the UT bookstore.
Oh,
okay.
there you
so
go.
Just,
I
just
like that.
doing that. All right.
Hook 'em horns.
But it was a learning process because these were really, really new tools, and they were not really in the traditional toolkit of senior policymakers and how to use them. So it was a hard education process, but once the efficacy started to being seen, senior decision makers relied more and more on these tools to get at the goals that were directed by the president and the vice president.
If I could just
Yeah,
add,
please.
so the innovation of this, when before 9/11, it was kind of like the Cuba sanctions program. It was like a trade embargo against the country. And as Juan said, the innovation was really targeted against the bad behavior. And our deputy secretary at the time started to call them not sanctions, but targeted financial measures, because they weren't necessarily just sanctions. And in fact, the Banco Delta Asia example, which is a chapter in Juan's book,
important.
I think the impact of it, we were even surprised at the reaction that we got, and the impact was way beyond. And I think we can talk a little bit about maybe overusing it. We just did another Patriot Act Section 311 on Bank of Dandong, which is a little closer to home for China. But I think that this was a time of kind of testing the tools, educating, and then even coming up with this new name of targeted financial measures to see what would work, and the carrots and the sticks.
Can I ask you to follow up on that reference to the Patriot Act, which I'm sure for some people in the audience, you think, Patriot Act? What's that got to do with this? What is the Section 311 tool? What is this?
It's where the Secretary of the Treasury has the authority to designate either a jurisdiction, a entity, or a class of transactions, which is your favorite, as a primary money laundering concern, which basically cuts the correspondent banking relationships, which is basically a death sentence for anybody wanting to do business in dollars. So is that kind of a layman's?
I think it's important for the Patriot Act to keep in mind, again, this post 9/11 sort of revolution in the space. Title III of the Patriot Act, where Section 311 appears, is an entire section on basically the broadening and deepening of the anti-money laundering system. And so all these reporting requirements for banks now applied to broker dealers, jewelers, insurance companies. So you now are expanding this reporting requirement. You're requiring everybody to have anti-money laundering systems in place. You're giving the Treasury Secretary new tools. You're establishing new standards internationally. So the Patriot Act, in some ways, puts these tools and some of the capabilities to include the use of intelligence, by the way, in some of the targeted sanctions and you'll appreciate this as a lawyer for the law students out there, allowing then for that evidentiary that's based on intelligence to be reviewed in camera and ex parte, so cannot be confronted by the target of the use of those powers, right? Pretty extraordinary. That's in the Patriot Act as well. So it was an entire sort of period of let's figure out how to use these authorities, broaden and deepen them, begin to use the targeted sanctions more effectively, push diplomatically as a way of then establishing these norms. And it was really a kind of a revolutionary wave that we're still in the middle of, and we're dealing with both positive and negative externalities from that revolution.
And if I can just add on top of that, I mean, I think I post-state these guys a little bit, in government, and my time at the White House, I can tell you that all the hard work that you guys had to put in bringing these things in the conversation as a standard thing, it paid off. Because there were no conversations, basically, during the entire time I was working on the Iran file and broader, from 2009 to 15, in which discussion about how to use economic sanctions and financial sanctions and targeted measures, et cetera, wasn't part of the conversation. And I think it bears just sort of keeping that in mind, that this is a dramatic change in U.S. national security policy making. It really is different. And it's something that whenever you're now having a discussion in the Situation Room about what to do, it's not, oh, should we talk to those Treasury guys or should we talk about sanctions? And it's kind of an afterthought. In fact, actually, the agendas are now essentially stacked such that one of the first topics to come up is financial sanctions, economic sanctions, et cetera. And related to that, I think even though there is still a lot of mystique about what they are and how they work, of course, Congress has also gotten into the act, and now actually I think part of the problem we have is that sanctions are seen as kind of this universal Swiss Army knife. That any problem that we have, we can automatically solve if we just 311 this, or if we just ban correspondent banking accounts from that. And I think we'll talk further in our conversation about the risk of overuse, but it's worth noting that I think at this point, our problem potentially is less convincing people there's merit here. Our problem is convincing people, okay, there's also limitations here, and maybe we ought to have a conversation about that.
Actually, that sets up a very nice question. What are the limitations? Why isn't this a panacea? And I'm going to start using 311 as a verb, as you just did, in ordinary life.
Well, I'll give you my opinion on this. I mean, I think there are a couple of reasons. First is, if you think about let's be simple here, diplomatic, sanctions, military options, right? Military is, in many ways, at least in a limited, specific sense, decisive, or can be decisive, right? If you go that far, especially given the military capabilities the United States has, you can bring to bear, I think, decisive pressure. Diplomatic, much less cost. We were talking earlier today about alliances and the coalition, the willing concept of easy to get in, easy to get out. That's diplomacy at the heart. I mean, not with respect to alliances per se, but you can have a conversation with somebody and impress upon them how important it is that a country does something that we wish them to do. But at the end of the day, there aren't necessarily consequences attached to them refusing to do so unless you decide to make that. Sanctions fill this gap in terms of giving you more leverage than you get under diplomacy without being necessarily as problematic with respect to military force. And that's the trap, because people then tend to read into that, well, that means we can apply sanctions and there are few costs, or all the costs are being borne by our adversary. And I think one of the things that we're likely to learn sometime in the next 20 to 30 years, if not much sooner than that, is that a combination of the changing global economic environment in which we are still going to be the top dog, but increasingly not the only top dog, combined with the fact that the more sanctions programs you have, the more it is difficult to be aggressive on all of them, it's going to make us kind of sit back and think a little bit. And I'll give you a very practical example about this. We have over 30 sanctions programs right now. If you go and you count on the Treasury Department website, you get up to 30. All of them sound great independently. We should have a CT sanctions program. We should have a human rights sanctions program. We should have an Iran sanctions program, a North Korea sanctions program. I think that it's reasonable for us to have a blood diamond sanctions program. But if you go through all of those, and then you go out to the world and you say, here are the 30 different classes of behavior that we don't think that you should do, or you will not be allowed to do business in the United States, that's intense, right? Especially if you start adding more and more targets and more individuals that are subject to those sanctions. To the extent that you're being aggressive on all of those fronts, questions start getting asked about, well, gee, who can we do business with, in your opinion, America? And you start raising questions in the financial sector about de-risking. How do we put some of our business offshore of the United States such that there is no connection, which I think also has a risk of limiting use of the tool. So in my opinion, I think there is a limitation established by economic reality internationally. There's a limitation about how much we want to disincentivize doing business in the United States and how much we want to complicate doing business inside of the United States. And then there's the issue, frankly, of just objectives. If you have 30 priorities, you have none, right? If you have to give the Treasury Secretary and the Secretary of State 30 different talking points to issue at any one particular meeting, you aren't getting at least 26 of those. And you're not entirely sure which of those 30 you're in fact going to get across. And so from that perspective, when you bring to mind all the various different other priorities we have, I think that the tool can be limited, but also the amount of space that you have to use it is also limited.
Yeah, so I mean, I also worry about the diminishing utility. Two of the same reasons, and then a third. I mean, certainly the first, sanctions fatigue. And, oh no, another one? We have to now understand this one, or we have to put in place this one. And for what? I mean, North Korea gets to be more of a threat. Their nuclear capability is growing. Their missile capability is growing. Iran seems in some quarters to getting stronger. So, the correlation on the increase in sanctions and North Korea lethality, it might not be in the trend that we'd like. Also, a second reason is more shaky economies that would potentially adhere to certain sanctions. They're looking to make a buck. I mean, they actually need to, new markets, find markets, and especially when China is, in the past has flouted a lot of these things. A number of countries, I think, potentially, if China were a weaker factor, a less prosperous factor, might adhere. But you can come under a China umbrella. Well, they're not doing it. Why do we need to? But the third reason is something that concerns me the most. And look, when I was in the White House and with Juan and working with Janice, and when we talked about sanctions on North Korea or Iran, and we thought about blowback against us, we'd be concerned about Iranian terrorist activities or what Iran would do against, our troops and our allies in Afghanistan and in Iraq. When we thought about North Korea, what was the Kim regime going to do? Would they set off something else? What potential military things, would they do? What we never, ever thought was, what could they do back to our economy, right? I mean, back when we were putting sanctions on North Korea in the 2000s, they have $1,000 GDP, right? What could they possibly do to our economy? To our people, to terrorists, to missiles, to nukes, yes. But to our economy? Okay, fast forward to now, when North Korea, and this gets to cyber-enabled economic warfare, I'll get to later, but when North Korea has one of the most capable cyber capabilities, and they have been aggressively going after financial institutions, not just to steal money, right, but to weaken those financial institutions. Right, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to think, if you're an advisor in Pyongyang or an advisor in Tehran, at what point do you say, you know what? We're sick of the Americans constraining our ability to operate in international financial markets with this cyber capability of ours. We can constrain them. So That, to me, is something that I think a lot about. I still like sanctions. I still think there is a purpose for them. I think we need to actually be more aggressive on some. But I definitely think that we need to harden the castle walls, because blowback on these things is going to come more fast and furious and in a way that we never had to consider when we were putting them on.
I like to agree and disagree with what's been said, because I couldn't agree more that there are huge negative externalities and complications for the way that these strategies and tools have been applied. First and foremost, sanctions or financial measures used without a strategic purpose or without a tie to a broader strategy can not only be meaningless, but can also be counterproductive. And so that's the problem, and Richard pointed to it, of this knee-jerk reaction to always just sanction. Sanctions are the one thing you can count on to be a unanimous vote in the U.S. Congress, right? It's just everyone loves it. It sounds good. It's something they can point to, and it usually is meaningful, right? So, but you run the risk of the sanctions or the financial measures not tying to a strategy and not really understanding what you're trying to achieve. I think we're running that risk in the Russian context. Right? Are we trying to get Russia out of Crimea? Are we trying to dissuade their adventurism in Eastern Europe? Are we trying to enforce the Minsk agreement? What is it actually that we're trying to do long term? And I think the less clarity there is, the more not only confusion but division with our allies, especially with Europe. So that's one point. I think that's absolutely right. And Samantha's point about the application of these sanctions in a way that begins to impact major G20 economies like Russia, now potentially China, is also really important, because these are actors that can bite back. They can bite back with their own economic and financial resources, or in the case of North Korea or even Iran, with asymmetric tools that affect our economy. And with more and more interconnectivity of our national economic resources and infrastructure, there's more vulnerability, right? So that's absolutely right. And I also think there's a potential overburdening of the private sector. I said, look, private sector is an important part of this, but there's only so much you can ask of the private sector to do in terms of managing risk. In some ways, we're asking bank compliance officers to be better experts on dual-use items than State Department officials are. Is this aluminum tube a real aluminum tube, or is it going to some clandestine nuclear program? How's the guy at a major global bank, the relationship manager, supposed to know that? They've got to go out and inspect. They've got to do online research. So it begins to be a little bit too much. So I agree with all that. And I agree with the fact that you also created a potential incentive to not deal in dollars and to offshore sort of activity. Here's where I disagree, though. I think if we remain true to what has made these sanctions so effective over the last few years, which is girding them and underscoring why it is that they are important. Not because we dislike a party and we want to diplomatically harm them or to put punitive measures on somebody or something, but instead because of the underlying behavior that's at play. And so what you've seen with the sanctions since 9/11 is we deal with now terrorist financing. We deal with proliferation finance. We deal with corruption and kleptocracy. We deal with human rights abuses. Now we even deal with malicious cyber activity. All of that now forms part of the sanctions regimes that Richard was talking about, embedded in some of the country regimes and even independently. The sanctions are incredibly effective if we actually are targeting actors that are engaged in that underlying activity. Why? Because those are international norms and delicts and crimes that everyone around the world has agreed should not be allowed. These are things that banks and insurance companies and shippers shouldn't be facilitating anyway. And so if we're undergirding our sanctions regimes with on the basis of these international norms and the behaviors that we are trying to isolate, we actually reinforce their power. I'll take you back to the FIFA example one more time. FIFA example was Southern District of Florida prosecutor brought a case against elements of FIFA, the soccer organization in the U.S. for corruption. The world goes up in arms. Again, why does the U.S. even care about this? This now has, multinational repercussions. This looks like a unilateral overreach by the U.S. The reality was everyone around the world knew FIFA was corrupt. The Europeans in the FATF context had even done a typologies paper precisely around the FIFA corruption problem. Everyone knew that there were problems with the bidding issues around who would host the next World Cup. The problem was the U.S. actually had the nerve to enforce what everyone had agreed to. But the strength of that was the fact that everyone then had to enforce what they had agreed to. And so despite all the complaints, despite the claims that this was unilateral actions by the U.S. or even some conspiracy theories that we were upset that Qatar had gotten the bid and we didn't, so that's why we were doing this.
That's all right, we're not going to qualify.
Yeah, we're not qualifying. So. But or maybe it's the only way we can. Right? But in any event, it forced the Swiss, it forced the Brazilians, it forced FIFA to engage in a whole range of actions. Why? Because they had agreed to the norms. We had put together facts and data to actually reinforce those norms. And we were basing our sanctions, in this case, an indictment, based on those international principles. If we do that, that in some ways buttresses every element of American power in this domain and frankly brings other allies along with us in a pretty fundamental way.
So just,
Please.
Go ahead, please.
So one clarification. So I think, at the end of last year, we rolled back the Burma program. So now there's 29. We just rolled back I'm not in the government anymore, but we just rolled back the Sudan program. So there's 28. So I think that there's some sense of reviewing and taking a look at the behavior. Yeah. Sudan is still on the state-sponsored list, but okay, that's another issue. But I think the clarification is all those entities on the OFAC list, which I think are like 5,000 now, they're U.S. sanctions. I mean, a lot of the CT sanctions have been multilateralized in the UN, but many of the proliferation sanctions, they're just U.S. So they only go on the borders of the United States. So it's kind of like grade inflation, which you guys can relate to. I mean, if everybody doesn't say, okay, we're going to now normalize, then those that don't follow the rules are the ones that are going to be advantaged, right? And so that's why it kind of gets back to the Iran sanctions that Juan was talking about, where at the time we were taking all these targets to the UN, and we would take a Pakistani target and the Chinese would say veto, not doing it. And so we were like, how do we get around this? And I remember, I think it was Secretary Rice at the time said to Treasury, what could count without going to the UN? What can we do without getting this consensus? And that's where we went to bilaterally to the foreign capitals, as Juan mentioned, but then even bypassing foreign governments and going right to the private sector. And that's where timing really matters. Our secretary at the time was Secretary Paulson, who was a force of nature, came from Goldman, had lots of credibility with the banks, and he would just say straight up, is this a reputational risk that you can afford? And so that was the suasion. It wasn't sanctions. So I think when we talk about the OFAC sanctions and the 30 programs, most of those are unilateral. We have to look at what is multilateral and then what's not even a sanction, right?
I think it's fair. I mean, I quibble a little bit because we all know that banks, especially banks that are operating in New York, even if they are in fact foreign banks primarily, they are going to respect what OFAC puts on the table. And look, that's part of the value. I mean, I didn't spend an awful lot of time dropping a lot of new designations on the Iranians because I didn't think that they were going to have impact. We thought they were going to have impact. We wanted them to have impact. I guess my real point here is that that's all well and good if you've got a few specific priorities you're going after, and especially if you can tie it back, I agree with Juan, to things that are kind of unambiguously bad acts of behavior. And this is why the non-proliferation effort with respect to Iran, in my view, was so successful, and why I don't think we can recapitulate it with regard to other areas of bad behavior. It was viscerally obvious to many, and even then we had to spend a lot of years doing it, that nuclear weapons in the hands of Iran was a bad thing. right? That was a relatively easy selling point. We had to spend a lot of time convincing people that it wasn't Iraq 2003 redux, right? But after we were able to convince folks that, in fact, we had a very serious problem with respect to Iran's nuclear program, we overcame some of those bits of hesitancy. My concern is that our sanctions programs could increasingly be construed less as being about individual bad acts of behavior and targeted on bad behavior, and more about our disregard and dislike for certain countries and concerns with certain countries. And I think the problem with that is then you do start feeding into the question of what other countries can do to us. And this goes, I think, to the broader issue of partnerships and alliances that you wanted to talk about here. Two examples that I just think are worth keeping in the back of your mind. Over the course of the last year, there has been a major new sanctions threat that's been issued. It's been issued by China towards the United States. It's been with respect to Taiwan arms sales. In fact, the Chinese said very clearly that they are considering the option of cutting off from access to China U.S. companies that are involved in sales of weapons to Taiwan. And their justification is that it undermines one China policy and breakaway province, et cetera. We don't have to like that. We don't have to agree with it. We don't have to think it's the right thing to do, and we can contest those sorts of steps. But I posit to folks here, folks in the business community, if you were to start having the discussion put to you the same way we've been putting the discussion to Europe for a very long time, it's either us or Iran, and the Chinese were to say it's either us or Taiwan. At what point is that going to start contributing to your own national decision making? And at what point is that going to become an area of conflict between the United States and China? And deservedly so. Just as the Chinese would defend their companies, we would have to defend our companies. We would do it at the State Department, Treasury would do it too. But it's a point of just sort of acknowledgement, in my view, that in this increasingly multipolar economic world, there are going to be other countries that are so valuable to the U.S. economy, which already derives something like 25% of our national income from foreign trade and from foreign investment, that are going to become vulnerable to this kind of pressure from other sides. And this is part of the reason why I wanted to highlight that as a risk. The other risk that I want to speak to is the issue of decertification with respect to Iran. And I probably won't surprise people considering I helped negotiate it. I disagree with Mr. Abrams about his description of the JCPOA. There's no point in relitigating that here. But one thing I will say with respect to the issue of decertification, I think it is dangerous to proceed on the assumption that a $20 trillion economy versus a $400 billion economy is going to win in all respects, and that the Europeans are going to automatically follow the U.S. lead. My reading of the history from 1996 to 2010 is a little bit different. And in my review of the history, it was the Europeans refusing to abide by U.S. unilateral sanctions that are imposed against the Iranian oil and gas sector, and instead actually threatening to take us to the WTO, passing a blocking statute, which actually provides for retaliatory measures against U.S. companies. And by the way, that law is still on the books in Brussels. And so it may be true that given EU political dynamics and trying to get 28 member states together and all that, that would be unachievable. But I think it is risky for us to assume that because we are so big, because we are so economically attractive, one, that there aren't going to be companies that aren't going to say, well, I just won't have a US business line. I'll have an Iran business line, I'll stay in Europe, it's fine. And that undermines our ability to get what we want out of the Iranians, by the way. But second, that we aren't actually reinforcing some of the lack of cooperation with US efforts that we've spent the last 20 years actually trying to overcome. And I think it's just a risk, especially in the context of alliances and partnerships.
I was just going to raise, on the JCPOA side, what Richard raises also sort of highlights the point I was making earlier, which is in the context of the JCPOA, I think we lost the focus of what made those sanctions and pressure campaigns so darn effective. Because we moved away from a focus on the underlying activity that was risky from Iran. We negotiated the nuclear part, but in saying we can still apply sanctions on these other issues like terrorist financing, support to Assad, human rights violations, even cyber activity. Those are out there, but let's actually promote commercial activity with Iran, despite all those risks. right? So fundamental to the JCPOA is the idea of the reintegration of Iran into the financial and commercial order, when the very essence of the sanctions programs across the board is to actually unplug them until they deal with that underlying risky behavior, which, regardless of what the U.S. relationship with them is like, is a part of being a responsible international actor. So that's actually the fundamental problem with the JCPOA, and why, by the way, the Iranians have been so upset that British and French and German banks haven't been willing to go back in and provide financing for anything. It's not just because they're a little bit afraid of OFAC or the U.S. Treasury doing something. In fact, we had Secretary Kerry out trying to convince them all to do business. And guess what? They all said, no way. Why? Because we're actually worried about that underlying risk and activity, those behaviors that, oh, by the way, you were telling us about for years. And so there's a fundamental contradiction here, which is important to keep in mind as we think about the JCPOA debate, because it all boils down to what these sanctions were about ultimately. And if it was about the underlying behavior and dealing with the risk of Iran using the financial and commercial order for these other things, then the JCPOA is fundamentally in tension with that. It's not to suggest we decertify or pull out of it, but it is to suggest that there is an inherent tension here as to how we unwind these sanctions, especially when we have sanctions around a broad range of behaviors, and we've negotiated around just a few of those behaviors.
One of the things that's fascinating about this discussion is how it's highlighted that both our allies and partners and our competitors alike sometimes have enough economic power and leverage of their own to deter us from using this tool. And that from an academic perspective, I immediately start thinking of, it's within domain deterrence. We've got this capacity, but so do they, and it's all within the same domain. But earlier we were interjecting with cyber, and it made me think, Samantha, about your project, because of course, one of the options, if you're not strong, if you're North Korea or you're Iran, you're not strong in the same domain, then you pivot over to some other domain where you do have some capacity to inflict cost. So we think about using our economic leverage. They think about punching back with cyber means. We got some hints of this being in the offing. It could be happening, in the week ahead. There was a discussion in the news recently of possibly adding the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, to sanction them directly. And there was a loud and vocal response. And some of the commentary said, if we do this, if Iran decides to push back, that'll probably be a cyber response. This leads me to want to ask you to share some thoughts about where your project intersects with this topic, and then we'll open it to the floor for a few questions before we split.
Right, so cyber-enabled economic warfare is the use of cyber means by state and non-state actors against economic targets in order to weaken a country militarily or politically. Right? So it is not just good old economic espionage to get market advantage. It might have some of that, but it's dual use. Right? It is getting at the economic wherewithal, undermining the economic wherewithal. Remember how I started the conversation, which, the United States, we're the #1 military because we're the #1 economy, strike at our economy, and it weakens our abilities along a number of different dimensions. So it's everything, and it's not just North Korea and Iran asymmetric. The largest IP theft, intellectual property theft, is of course occurring from China, right? And I think the evidence is clearly showing that there is reason to be concerned that it is not, again, just to give China a market advantage in certain areas, but if we don't have the intellectual property, a number of things happen. One, it diminishes the interest of innovators to actually create new products and take them to market, because you can't own your capital. You can't innovate, you can't take advantage, you can't monetize those things if the Chinese are just going to rip you off, on day one. More pernicious is if the Chinese are stealing this intellectual property, they have the ability to be able to undermine us military systems, other things like that. Where it gets very much connected into this space are the ratcheting up of the attacks that we see against financial institutions, banking institutions. I think that we need to be paying much more attention to the types of cyber attacks that the North Koreans are launching on South Korea and have been consistently since 2009, going after their ATM systems, including in 2011 and 2013, for a time shutting down ATMs across South Korea, the largest Korean bank. Can you imagine what the people here in this country would face if we couldn't get to our ATMs, if our ATMs shut down and we weren't able to access our money? How many people, 40% of this country live paycheck to paycheck, right? They can't, what? They wouldn't be able to, afford diapers or their medicine. All right, now imagine this happening when we're about to deploy troops. Okay, so you can really kind of see how that takes on. But one other example beyond North Korea, Iran. So you may have heard about the Iranian attack on Aramco in 2012. It burnt out about 35,000 Saudi Aramco computers. It didn't stop pumping because those were not on the same system, but it basically prohibited Aramco from sending any emails, signing any contracts, anything that went across their networks. Now, Aramco had the financial wherewithal to basically deploy a team to Southeast Asia, and in a week they bought 50,000 hard drives in Southeast Asia. In fact, if you look at the price of hard drives during that time worldwide, it went up, right? But how many companies could do that? Iran launched a similar Shamran 2 attack very recently, again at Aramco and a number of other companies. So, as we walk into the upcoming Aramco IPO, right, potentially $100 billion, the largest IPO in history, right? JP Morgan, HSBC are some of the key underwriters, right? Again, if you were an advisor in Tehran, if I were an advisor in Tehran, right, and you're looking at Saudi as your mortal enemy, and you're thinking they're going to get $100 billion into their coffers soon, and I have the ability to screw it up. Oh yeah, I'm doing that. So, and now it's into financial markets and across networks. So these are the types of things. It's not just to gain a market advantage, it is to weaken a country's militarily or politically.
So why don't we, in our very limited time, get a few questions from the audience? And I might take a couple of questions first to make sure we get more than one. There's a gentleman right down the middle there with his hand up, if one of the microphones could make their way to him.
No, with an hour earlier.
China has proposed pricing imported oil in yuan backed by gold so that they can get out of the dollar receptance. And they wouldn't need to hold U.S. treasuries because they wouldn't be awash in U.S. dollars. Is this an example of what you're talking about?
Is this a form of de-risking?
Well, it's a type of financial independence and power on the part of the Chinese. Absolutely, they're trying to expand the use of the renminbi. They're clearly trying to play more of a leadership role in the current structure, but they're trying to create alternate structures, so alternate payment systems. Use of alternate currencies. You've seen this with the ruble renminbi trade between Russia and China. You've seen this with Union Pay, right? They don't rely on Visa and MasterCard. They've got Union Pay. The Russians are doing something similar. All of this is in furtherance of economic independence and influence. What's interesting here, something to watch, is the role of digital currencies. Because the Chinese have gone back and forth as to how they want to play it. They've recently banned digital currency exchanges, in part because most central banks want to be able to control currency and capital flows. I think the Chinese are very worried about what digital currencies bring. And so just like they're trying to upset the balance of the role of the dollar and really try to create alternate structures, to the point you made, they're also contending with other market forces that are challenging their own control. So keep an eye on that.
And this is where Treasury doesn't have one view. We have the kind of the terrorism financial intelligence side. We're going after the bad guys, but the international affairs side, who are really trying to protect the role of the dollar, like, oh no, you can't overreach and overuse these sanctions because that will blow back on us, but they'll just get out of the dollar market. Exactly. So these are discussions that we have had. They've even talked about creating a new competitor to SWIFT, so that they don't have to go through that system. So I think that's a really good example.
Over here.
So my question is in the same vein about these digital currencies. In regards to attacks, cyber attacks on a large scale that target specific American users and sort of hold their data hostage until you pay in a digital currency, what kind of strategies would be effective in countering these types of attacks?
Well, I'm glad you asked about counter strategies because it gets to alliances and partnerships specifically. So when we look at the 5, I'd say, cyber superpowers in the world, right? The United States, clearly, China, Russia. I'd still contend the UK. They've got certain interesting capabilities, and Israel. Right? Now, on the good guy side of the ledger, that leaves the US, the UK, and Israel. The UK and Israel have the only cyber attaches in DC. They have 2 cyber, each one has a cyber attache in DC. When we need to do much more technologically, we're very close. The president has signed new agreements with the Israelis. We obviously work very, very closely with the Brits, but I would contend it's time for the issue you raised as well as other issues that we have much more robust technological and policy coordinations to protect the networks that free market democracies ride on, right? So I would say first, we really must do much more for free market democracies. Right? But beyond that, you pointed out the Bank of China, right? And how worried they are also about cyber attacks. So I do think, even though I'm quite hard on the Chinese, I do think if there's one element in China that we can, show a little ankle and start talking, not to bring into a cyber trilateral co-op, like I just talked about with the US, the UK, and Israel, but on a separate dimension of what we need to do to harden systems, I would absolutely start with the Chinese central bank. So we need better technological tools. We need the policies in place to actually go ahead and prosecute them. And we have to do much more on the frontiers of pushing back the bad guys in cyber.
So, out of respect for all your time and fear of Austin traffic, I've noted that we have reached our mark, and there probably are more questions to come, but hopefully you can grab our panelists before they depart. Let's thank them for a stimulating panel. And let me just say on behalf of Will and Steve and all our co-sponsors, Stratfor, LBJ, Texas National Security Network, thank you for being here today. The event is now closed, and we'll see you next year.
Thank you, Bobby.